is the demographic analysis program, which is one of two operations that U.S. Census Bureau used to measure coverage in the decennial census. Its research focuses on census coverage, historically undercounted populations, and international migration, measuring racial and ethnic diversity and population estimates. He is a member of the United Nations Expert Group on Refuge and Internally Displaced Person Statistics. And Eric received his PhD in rural sociology and demography from Penn State University. He started working at the Census Bureau in the fall of 2009 in the immigration statistics staff of the population division. So thanks everyone for coming here, and let's give a good welcome to Dr. Eric Jensen.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everyone. John, really appreciate the introduction. It was great to hear both times, so really appreciate that. I'm really excited to be invited here to talk about the population estimates and projections that are produced by the U.S. Census Bureau. Big appreciation to Kevin and to Dal and to John and everyone that helped coordinate this with me. My presentation is not going to be as California focused as the presentations already, just kind of an overview of the population estimates program and the projections, but I'm hoping to get in some discussion about questions you might have, because I know a lot of people use these data. So the population estimates program disseminates official measures of population and housing units between the decennial census. We make what are called post-census estimates. So they build on that most recent census. We developed these under Title 13 of the U.S. Code, Section 181. There's a lot of use cases for the population estimates. One of the bigger ones is population controls for surveys, also as denominators for vital rates, academic and business research, also program planning. We've been making population estimates at the Census Bureau since 1900. Our building, we've gone paperless a few years ago, and they had us go in and clean out, everything. And we're digging through these boxes and through these file cabinets, and we found like reports from like the early 1900s. So, I mean, we've been doing this a long time, and it's exciting. Back when California probably had very, very low population, but we've been making these. So every year we make a vintage of estimates, and the vintage means it's a time series. It goes back to the most recent census. So we do this as of July 1. That's our reference date. So we have released vintage 2023. We're going to start working shortly on vintage 2024. So that's going to be a time series from April 1st, 2020 up until July 1st, 2024. Okay, so why do we disseminate estimates? So it's a federal mandate, one, under Title 13. Another big reason why we make estimates is for allocating federal funds. There are trillions of dollars of federal funds that get allocated over the decade based on population. You're going to give more funding to California than you are to Wyoming, right? Population. Planning for public and private services. A big thing is controls for federal surveys. I'll talk more about this later in the presentation, but the American Community Survey, we've heard a lot about that already today. That's controlled to our population estimates. We do that for all the demographic surveys. That basically accounts for coverage issues in those surveys. And then also the denominators for vital rates. We have a good relationship. We have a close relationship with the National Center for Health Statistics. We get birth and death records from them that we use to make the estimates, and we give them back estimates that they can use for vital rates. So we make these population estimates for over 80,000 geographies and for over 40,000 communities. We make them at the national level. We do regions and divisions. We do states. We also do MSAs. Counties for Puerto Rico do the Commonwealth, so the state level Commonwealth. We also do the municipios, which is the county equivalent for Puerto Rico. Then below counties, we do incorporated places or cities, and we do minor civil divisions. That's more common on the East Coast, but it's another distinction. So this chart shows the type of estimates that we produce, and then the different geographic levels. So for total population, we do this for all geographic levels. So for the United States, for the metro micro areas, for counties, cities and towns, Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rico, or counties, cities, towns, Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rico municipios. For components of change, We do this for all of the geographic levels, except for cities and towns, because we have a different methodology. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then also for Puerto Rico municipios, we don't do components of change. For population characteristics for age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, we do that for the nation, states, and counties, and also metro micros. But for Puerto Rico, we only do age and sex, so we don't do race, Hispanic origin. At the national level, we do monthly population estimates, and we do that by different universes. So the resident population, household population, civilian, non-institutional. Big reason for that with the national level is because those are used as controls for the current population survey, which uses that civilian, non-institutional population. Group quarters population, we do that by characteristics of the national level, but for states and for counties, we only do the totals. And finally, housing units we do for the nation, states, and counties. So the methodology that we use for nation, states, and counties is the cohort component method. For that, we start with the population base. We add births, subtract deaths, and we add net migration, and that gives us our estimate. For the sub-county population, so this is cities and towns, we use what's called the distributive housing unit method. So we take the household population per housing unit, we multiply that by the number of housing units, then we have a rake factor to control it to the county total so that it's consistent with our other estimates. We add group quarters, and that gives us our population estimate. So this table shows the different components and their main source for data. For our base population, traditionally, we've used just the decennial census as is. But this decade, because of kind of when the data were available for us to use and some other limitations, we're using what's called our blended base approach. So this is combining three sources of data: the 2020 census, the vintage 2020 population estimates, and then the 2020 demographic analysis results. I'll talk more about this in a moment. For births, we get individual birth records from the National Center for Health Statistics. We also get individual death records from the National Center for Health Statistics. For domestic migration, we use IRS tax records. We also use Medicare enrollment records. And then for international migration, we use several different sources, primarily the American Community Survey. We also use the Puerto Rico Community Survey and then foreign censuses and population registers. And I'll talk later about some of the work we've been doing to supplement the American Community Survey-based estimates with additional administrative data from Department of Homeland Security and other agencies. So I mentioned the blended base. This was a really big thing for us. It was a new thing for us. Like I said, in the past, we would have just taken the most recent census, and that would have been what we used for the base population. Because of delays that happened during processing the 2020 census, also because of implementing a new disclosure avoidance approach, differential privacy, we needed to come up with something different. So we used the blended base. So for this, we're using the 2020 census results, and we use that for Hispanic origin, also for the group quarters and household populations. We use the 2020 demographic analysis estimates. So we do this by age and sex at the national level. And then we have the vintage 2020 estimates. And at the national level, we use this for race. So as we move down to the state, we no longer have demographic analysis estimates at the state level because those are only available at the national level. So we use vintage 2020 population estimates. And it's important to point out that those are based on the vintage 2010 census. But we do control that to the nation. And then the same for counties. And we also have a control to make sure that counties sum to states, and states sum to the nation. But again, this is a new approach for us. And I'm going to show later a way that it really helps improve some of the data products, some of the data that we have, especially for young children. So we produce our estimates every year when new vintage, and then we release them kind of on a rolling basis. December is when we have our first release. So this December, we'll have the vintage 2024 population estimates, and that'll be population totals, components of change, and also the voting age population for the nation states and Puerto Rico Commonwealth. In March, we have our population totals and components of change. So this is for the metro micro areas and counties, and also Puerto Rico municipios. In April, we do population age and sex, and this is at the national level. In May, we do our population totals for cities and towns. This is our sub-county estimates. And then we have housing units that also come out in May. And then June is usually our big release where we have characteristics across all geographies. So for the nation, states, and counties, we have full age, sex, race, Hispanic origin. There's several ways to access our population estimates. The main way is on our webpage. You can also get some of them on data.census.gov. You can get some on QuickFacts. And then a lot of people are using the application programming interface, or API. That's a great way to just kind of get all the estimates at once. And so that's what a lot of stakeholders are using. Okay, before I move on to population projections, are there any questions people have about population estimates? I want to just ask a few of those. Yeah, Dal.
I heard you reference household population earlier. Are all of these population figures only for households?
No, we produce, at every level, we produce resident population, but at the national level, we do break it down into different universes. So household population and group quarters population would be two separate two universes. And we also have the civilian non-institutional population. So does that get at your question?
Yeah, I was wondering, because when you do the blended base, I wondered how would you, but so you basically revert to total resident population.
On the blended base, we are using data from the 2020 census at all levels of geography to make that split between the household and the group quarters. And we do process our estimates by 7 group quarters types. So group quarters, there's not a lot of people live in group quarters, but it's a real challenge. I mean, if you do population estimates, it's hard, and 2020 census had a lot of, data collection issues, and especially in group quarters, because, during the pandemic, a lot of group quarters were just shut down. And so we weren't able to enumerate. A lot of colleges shut down, and so the college kids were off campus, and so it made a lot of issues. But that's, we do it in our blended base. We address that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about population estimates before I move on to projections? Yeah.
So I was going to save this question for later, but you touched on it a little bit. I remember in 2022, Census released a few programs to kind of look at group quarters more closely in the cities. And in Riverside specifically, that's something that we're thinking about doing. But I was wondering, now that we're a few years out from that program, what were the outcomes? Like, was there a significant change in the group quarters in the estimates? Or I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
Now that we're out from that program.
Yeah, so we always have this program called CQR, Count Question Resolution, where we make updates to the census. Like if we missed a apartment complex and people point that out, then we can make that adjustment. And this time we did the same thing for group quarters because we knew that the group quarters enumeration was problematic. In some places, it ended up, giving them several group quarters, people that did that process, and others, people submitted, and, the research that the Census Bureau did might have said that, oh, well, it's actually, we did pick it up, just maybe it was misgeocoded or something like that. So it had kind of various impact, right? That some places got an increase to their population, others didn't get as much as they might have hoped. And so that was it was called PG. Anyway, CQR is a program we do every year, every census, and this was a special one for group quarters. Okay. All right, I'm going to jump in on population projections. We don't produce population projections as recent or as current, sorry, not as often. That's the word I'm looking for, as often as we do for the population estimates. So we generally use those about every 3 years. Sometimes we'll have a bigger gap. But you're well aware, these are, it's a population for future dates. Our projections are only based on demographic trends, future demographic trends, assumptions about those. We don't use any economic forecasting. Our models are only based on the demographic processes, so births, deaths, and migration. We use our population estimates as the base, as the starting point for the population projections, and we only make those at the national level. We released state projections in the late 90s. That's the last time we released them. But even still, they're a good resource. A lot of states that produce population projections will kind of use ours as either a benchmark, or they'll use them actually in their processing as a control. So it is good that we produce them. So why do we disseminate them? For program planning and for public and private services, also academic and business research. So the way we create the population projections, we start with a base, and like I mentioned, it comes from our population estimates. We add births, we subtract deaths, then we add net migration. That gives us our projection. So the accuracy of the projections are really based on two things. First is the accuracy of that base population that we're using as a starting point. And second is the assumptions that we make about future fertility, mortality, and international migration. So again, since the late 90s, we've only produced projections at the national level. They're based on that most recent population estimate, and then they extend forward several decades. And our population projections can include total populations and then components, so births, deaths, net international migration. And then we have them by single year of age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and nativity. That's something we don't do in the population estimates. We don't do nativity, but in projections, we can because of how we process that. So it lets us maintain that. So our most recent projections were released last November, so November 2023. And these are the first Census Bureau projections to include 2020 census data. We had a main series and then 3 alternative immigration scenarios, so low, middle, and high. As you'd expect, international migration is kind of the biggest uncertainty for our population projections, and so that's why we do that approach. We don't do like probabilistic projections, but we do these different scenarios, and that's to kind of account for that uncertainty. So our most recent projection series went from 2023 to 2100, and we released age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and nativity through 2060, so 2023 to 2060. And then we released age, sex, and nativity for 2061 to 2100. We don't have a lot of confidence going out past 2060 on race, Hispanic origin. I mean, just look over the last few decades how even the definitions have changed for that. Look at earlier this year, the Office of Management and Budget released new guidelines for federal agencies to collect data on race and ethnicity. So it's really difficult to say, all right, 2100, this is going to be the race distribution of the United States. So that's why we're more confident in age and sex, and that's more of a demographic model. The 2023 projections were produced with basically the same methodology as the 2017 projections, just with updated input data. Okay, and you can only access the projections on our population estimates and projections website. Okay, before I move on from projections, any questions on those? Yeah.
I understand why, excuse me, I understand why you're reluctant to use race out there, but what happened to nativity? Are you still, well, is nativity based on one parent or two parents or either parent?
Nativity isn't based on the parent, it's based on the person. So the nativity is if the person's foreign born. And so the way we do our projections, we're going to start with that base population. We're going to have, projections of international migration. And so when those people come in, say like a woman comes in, her nativity status is going to be foreign born. And then as we're doing the projection, because it's cohort component model, we're going to apply fertility rates to that. If she's childbearing age, we'll apply a fertility rate to her. Her children won't be foreign born, they'll be native born. And so we're able with our process to keep that keep that nativity status within the projection model, if that makes sense.
I guess, yeah. Are you tracking at all who are the children of these mothers who were foreign born themselves but gave birth in the U.S.?
We don't in our model. I know other people do, like for instance, Jenny Van Hook at Penn State, like she's done work on she uses a cohort component model similar to what we do, and then she looks at like the second and third generation. We don't keep, we could in our model, but our model is all aggregated anyway. So it's not like we have, we take this individual, and apply a fertility rate. We do apply a fertility rate to an individual, but we don't it's not a person level model, if that makes sense. It's an aggregated model.
Yeah, I hate to pester you with another question on the same lines. I understand age and sex; those are crucial for program planning. But as you might know, I have written a little bit about this, and I wonder, so how do we use race or nativity in the future for any program planning exactly? And I know you want the core component detail to get a more accurate total. But I guess the question is why release future race? Because I mean, because it turns into a political football, and you could go further. That's why I was asking about the second generation, which is really different.
Right, right.
But I mean, maybe just duck the whole thing. I mean, just do age and sex in the future because we need that for, employment and education and, Social Security. But we don't need race or nativity for that necessarily. So,
Yeah, and especially the way that, the concept of race changes over
Yeah.
time. And like I mentioned, the
Yeah.
new standards from the Office of Management and Budget on collecting data on race ethnicity, that just shows, how agencies are going to collect those data. So, that's a big reason why we didn't extend the race and Hispanic origin characteristics all the way out to 2100. Just we don't have confidence in that. And from what you're saying, maybe we shouldn't have confidence in up to 2060. But I think there are some stakeholders that have looked at that. I know in the past, the Census Bureau, and I know you've written about this, but the Census Bureau, with our projections, would talk about when the United States would be a majority minority country because of the projections. And we've really kind of gone away from that approach and using that as a way of talking about diversity.
right, I noticed that and approved of that. It just, yeah, it's a real question as to, with racial blending, how do you report it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with our models that we do, because we assign race. So even in our estimates, we don't have the race of the child in the birth records. That's not reported in the birth records. It's not reported in the birth certificate. So we only have the race of the mother and when available, race of the father. So we have a process we call KidLink where we assign race to children.
Yeah.
And so that does allow for, multiracial births. And that's a similar process we use in our projections. So we do allow for that. But you're right, like what's the programmatic need for that? And it's something we've discussed, like at what point should we, and like we said, and at some point in the projection horizon, we stop releasing data by race ethnicity.
Oh, okay, it's a complicated process you're in.
Yeah.
It's delicate
Right.
and complicated. I mean, the more detailed, the more complicated it gets. And so I just.
Right. And the more uncertainty you're introducing,
Right.
for sure. Sure. Yeah, there and then Andreas.
I guess following up in regards to uncertainty, could you provide a little bit more background on why you chose to deal with uncertainty via the 3 alternative immigration scenarios as opposed to something like a probabilistic forecast?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of that is just kind of the resources that we have for our population projections. We're mandated every year to make population estimates, but we're not mandated to make population projections. And so just depending on the resources that are available, that's, if we produce them, that's why we produce them every couple years. But as far as the probabilistic estimates, that's something that we've been looking at quite a bit. We've talked with like Adrian Rafferty at University of Washington. He developed the UN's population Bayesian projections. And so we've been talking with him and with some of his students about incorporating those into our own, that model into our own projections processing. So it's something we're looking at for the future. We know it'd be an improvement over this deterministic approach we use, that it's pretty simple to say, all right, high, medium, low, international migration assumptions. So it's something we do want to look into more. Andreas.
I just want to know a little bit more about how do you track the nativity of the outgoing population, especially I'm assuming they're changing origin in your projections, right?
Yeah, so the reason we can do our estimates by nativity is because, we're bringing in, foreign-born immigration. We're taking out foreign-born immigration, people leaving. Our foreign-born immigration model for projections, kind of interesting what we do. We develop immigration rates for other countries, and then we apply those rates to the projections that are done by the Census Bureau for other countries. We have our international database, IDB, that the Census Bureau produces, and that has projections for, I think, like pretty much every country, like 200 countries or something. So what we do is we calculate by sending regions, because we don't do individual countries, you know, we do sending regions, but we do like Mexico as its own, but like a lot of the European countries are combined, for example, and then we'll apply those rates. And so that model is really trying to account for long-term population growth, you know, in other countries. As you know, international migration from Mexico the last like decade or so has slowed, and part of that is because of their age structure, right? And so what we want to do is to have in our long-term model, especially going out to 2100, have that be reflecting population trends for other countries. What it essentially does is it makes, you know, out to 2100 a lot of the international migrations from Africa, because those are the countries with the age structure that, you know, younger people tend to migrate. And so it's something that we've talked about. Do we, you know, incorporate like a gravity model or something so we can say not only the countries that have certain age structures, but also proximity matters, you know, for international migration. And so that is something we've talked about exploring. And so as we bring them in, as we bring immigration in, those people are native, they get nativity status, foreign-born status. And then we also use immigration rates that we develop at the start of the period. And as that country of origin composition changes during the projection period, we can then change as those immigration rates. But the immigration rates are pretty much stable at the beginning, but get applied to that foreign-born population throughout. Yeah, that's a really complicated process when I think about it. Anyway, I hope I got to your question, Andres. It's kind of like a net. Yeah, that's a really easy way of saying it.
There's a question from the virtual audience, Laura Nis. On slide 7, how do you get the household population per housing unit for the sub-county population estimate?
That comes from the decennial census. And so that part of our distributed housing unit method is that first yellow box, the household population per housing unit, persons per household, that comes from the census. And that is constant throughout the decade. That's something we know as a limitation. Everyone who uses the housing unit method knows that's a limitation of the housing unit method. It's just there's not a good source. Even the 5-year ACS isn't a good source for updating that. And so we basically have to keep that as a constant. Okay, so I want to just talk about a couple. I've gone through project estimates. I've talked about projections. I want to talk about just a couple of things that kind of impact the population estimates. So one is the undercount of young children. So in the 2020 census, young children ages 0 to 4 had a larger undercount than any other age group. They had a net undercount of 5.4%. In 2010, young children had an undercount of 4.6%, and is also the largest undercount of any age group. So this is a persistent issue that we see in the census. It's not just in the census, but we also see it in demographic surveys. We've done work showing that the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, also the Survey of Income and Program Participation, that young children have lower coverage rates in those surveys than other age groups. So this is something the Census Bureau is really committed to trying to improve, not only the coverage in the census and surveys, but also data products that we have for young children. This is a population pyramid, and it shows the vintage 2021 blended base. And I already talked through the blended base, but one of the main things to point out is that the blended base at the national level uses this age and sex data from the 2020 demographic analysis. So demographic analysis is one of our 2 coverage measures that we have at the Census Bureau for the decennial census. And for that method, we basically take historical and contemporary vital records, so births and deaths, data on international migration, and also for the older ages, we use data on Medicare enrollment to produce independent estimates that are independent of the census that we then compare to the census to estimate coverage. So for the blended base, we actually use those estimates for our age and sex distribution at national level. And I want you to look at these youngest ages, so down at the bottom. This red line is the 2020 census, and the blue line is our blended base. And really the big take home here is that the blended base, because of that DA control, we see more young children than we would have seen if we'd used the 2020 census. So it's basically improving or correcting the undercounted young children. It's important because, as you remember, the estimates are used for allocating, trillions of dollars of funding over the decade. They're also used as controls for the ACS, CPS, and all of our demographic surveys. So by improving that in the population estimates, it can have a big impact in improving data for young children and other sources. Okay, I also want to talk about international migration in the population estimates program. So one of the real challenges we have for the population estimates program is we have to produce estimates of international migration flows at the nation, state, and county levels by demographic details, so age, sex, race, Hispanic origin. To do this, we mostly use data from the American Community Survey. So for the total population of immigrants, of foreign-born immigration, so immigrants coming in, we use the American Community Survey and we look at the foreign-born population whose residence 1 year ago was abroad. And then we also use data from the American Community Survey to assign both the geographic distribution and the demographic characteristics to those populations. Those populations aren't big enough that we can distribute it all the way down to counties by single year of age, sex, race, Hispanic origin. So we have to use like distributions from the ACS. One issue we have is that when we do this, the ACS data are lagged by at least a year. So for our vintage 2024 population estimates, our most recent ACS file is going to be the 2023 ACS data that just came out. During COVID, we were able to supplement the ACS-based estimates with administrative data. And this was a big help to make our estimates more current. And I'll show you an example of that. So,
Eric,
yeah.
Can I ask a technical question? It's
Huh?
always bothered me. So the ACS is collected every month of the year. So you don't know when in the year the observation was made.
Right.
So then when it comes to timing issues, so do you assume like it's basically all July, mid-year?
Yeah, so the ACS is collected continuously. I think they say the only days it's not like collected people aren't in the field collecting data is like Christmas and Thanksgiving, right? So we're always out there bugging people for data. But it's controlled to the July 1 estimate, and July 1 is the midpoint for the year. We assume half the people have had their birthday, the other half will have it after that. So there's different interpretations of if it's a calendar year estimate, the ACS, or if it's an estimate year estimate. But one thing is it's a period estimate though. Even though it's collected every month, and they get a new sample each month as they're doing it, you can't use the ACS for looking at like seasonal variation within any of the results. So
But then why is it lagged? You say it's lagged because of it's asking about Roya, or it's lagged on top of that?
it's lagged because the file hasn't been, so the complete file, like right now for vintage 2024 that we're using, that we're starting our production right now, the most recent full data are the vintage, or
the
sorry, are the
collection is
2023
lagged.
ACS.
Okay,
So it's when the file's available.
got it.
That's why it's lagged.
Got it. Okay.
So this graph, the bars are different administrative data for foreign-born immigrants. And so the blue line are immigrant visas that were issued in that particular year. We also have work visas in orange. We have student data in the kind of darker teal, and then in the lighter teal, we have humanitarian migrants. As you can see, like starting in 2010, it tracked, and then the solid black line are our foreign-born immigration estimates. So this is the residents 1 year ago population in the American Community Survey. And then the dashed line in black are adjusted foreign-born immigration estimates. So as you can see, for a lot of the 2010s, our ROI estimates tracked really well with the administrative data. Starting in 2017, we see it was not quite as high. The big thing that happened is in 2020, as you know, almost all international migration was stopped during the COVID pandemic. But yet we were using data that still showed a really high level of international migration because we carried that last year forward. So we had to make an adjustment. So we looked at these different administrative data sources and we said, all right, we need to adjust this down. Well, the opposite thing happened coming out of the pandemic. The ACS was still low because it was showing those trends that happened during the pandemic. And we knew that the foreign-born immigration had increased. So then we had to make an adjustment up. And you see that in 2022, which is the far right bar. And so this is something that was helpful for us because we learned how to use these other administrative rec data, and combine them with our ACS approach. So as you know, there's been increased immigration at the southern border in recent years, and this has been a challenge not only for the U.S. Census Bureau, but for other federal agencies as well to try to measure in both estimates and in projections. So this is something that the U.S. Census Bureau population estimates has dealt with, the Congressional Budget Office and their population projections, also the Office of Housing of Homeland Security Statistics at DHS. This is something they've also dealt with. Earlier this last month, we released a working paper kind of talking about how different agencies estimate international migration flows and kind of comparing and contrasting those. And I have the link to that here. So a major research priority for the population estimates program this last year has been identifying ways that we can make that ACS-based estimate more current. We've consulted with academics to try to improve our methodology for estimating these migration flows, and we've explored administrative data. So we're looking at DHS border protection releases. We're looking at DHS field operation parolees. We're also looking at State Department refugee processing data. So basically, we feel that our estimates are not capturing humanitarian migrants in that first year that they're coming here, and they're lagged. And so we know the big increase of the southern border has been a lot of humanitarian migrants. And so that's what we're looking to kind of supplement in the ACS approach. So that's something that we're planning for this current or this next vintage of population estimates. How are we doing on time? Do we have a set stopping point?
No, yeah, okay. We started about 15 minutes late, so
Okay.
we have about 20
Great. I
minutes.
just have one more section then. So finally, I want to talk about the population estimates and then the American Community Survey. So we get this question a lot. How are the ACS estimates different from the population estimates? Both disseminate population and housing estimates. Both have characteristics by demographic characteristics, so age, sex, race, Hispanic origin. So I mentioned earlier, the population estimates are used as controls for the ACS population housing data. And so the one-year estimates for large areas are going to be consistent. And if you look at this table I have here, this is from data.census.gov. This is the 2022 American Community Survey, and this is the survey estimate for the total population. If you look at the margin of error, there isn't one, right? They have little stars there. And that's because it's controlled to the population estimates. So there's no sampling error in that estimate, in that survey estimate. And the reason we control the ACS estimates to the population estimates is basically account for coverage error. That's the big reason in the survey. So looking at how they're different, so the ACS is a sample estimate, whereas the population estimates, we're using that either most recent census or like with the blended base, we're using this full count, and then we're creating population estimates from that. The ACS not only collects demographic information, but as you know, collects like other important social, economic, and housing and demographic characteristics that we don't have in the population estimates. We do use administrative records, and we're not doing this on a sample of the population, but we have administrative records on all births, for example, or all deaths that are reported. So that's a big difference. The ACS has population and housing characteristics. The POP estimates, we don't have any social and economic detail, but we do have age, sex, race, Hispanic origin. We have housing units just for totals. Both data are collected and released or are produced every year. The ACS is collected every year and released every year, and our population estimates are released every year. And then the ACS, we have 1 year estimates, and that's January 1 to December 31st. So it's a period estimate for that year. We also have our 5-year estimates, which you could think about as the average of a characteristic over the 5 years. So it is also a period estimate. And then in pop estimates, we use, like I said earlier, the July 1st reference date. So ACS, we have 1 year ACS estimates for geographies of 65,000 or more population. And then we have 5-year ACS estimates down to the block group level for some things. And then I went through all the different geographies for our population estimates. And then statistics with the ACS, we do have margins of error that are calculated at the 90% confidence interval to account for sampling error. With our population estimates, they're not a product of sampling. So we don't have, for instance, like statistical confidence intervals. They're just not needed. And then we also release our entire time series, I mentioned earlier, back to the most recent census. And so we don't average the time periods like we do in the 5-year file, where it's an average of the 5 years. We have, each individual year broken out in our vintage of estimates. Okay, I have just a slide with some like contact information, but we'll jump to this one. So questions. So any questions people have? I know we've talked about some things as we've been going along, but any additional questions? Yeah.
Just a moment, please. The blended base, the undercount of the of children, the vintage and then the blended base. Just tell me the distinctions and when you. How do I say this? How do we collect? I see the vintage up there, and then the blended when I go to the website, and then the blended is what? That's a different collection, data set collection, or how do I know if I'm dealing with the blended?
Okay, so when you go to our website and you
Mhm.
see the different estimates, we release a vintage of estimates. So for, let's say, the vintage 2023 population estimates, they're out. You'll have a July 1st estimate for
Mhm.
2023,
Mhm.
July 1st, 2022, 2021. You'll have a July 1st, 2020, and then you'll have the blended base. Now, the blended base is our base population that we start to build the estimates from.
Okay,
So
good.
the blended base is April 1st, 2020.
There's a question from the virtual participant Pyung Nguyen from DOF. Do you have an update version of blended data 2020 after the release of PL94?
Yeah, we okay. So I think this might be asking about the PL94 data or the redistricting data. And so those are the 2020 census data with race in them. We don't have a blended base yet that incorporates race data from the 2020 census. To do that, we have to have this extra step that we call modified race. So the 2020 census race question included an option for people to say some of their race. The input data that we use for pop estimates does not include that some of the race category. That's because we used the 1997 OMB standards, which said you couldn't use an other category. And so other federal agencies don't include other or some other race. The Census Bureau does for the decennial, though, and for the ACS, because we were mandated in the early 2000s. There was a law, and they said you have to, for any funding for decennial, you have to include some other race. It was a way that they could maintain that Hispanics would respond to the race question. Not all Hispanics are some other race, but almost all some other race. People that mark some other race are Hispanic. So each decade we do this process where we take the some other race population and we allocate them into other race categories, the other OMB race categories, and we call that modified race. We do that so our population estimates, we do that because the input data we use for population estimates does not include the sum of the race. So we have this process. Well, for 2020, it was really difficult because there were almost 50 million, some of the race alone or in combination population. That's a lot. So that's a lot that we have to reallocate. And so we're still finalizing that file. We were actually supposed to release it September 5th, and we found an issue in it. And so we're revising it so we can get that out there. It's something that we need in the population estimates program in order to make our estimates. It's something that a lot of our stakeholders, like the different members of like our federal state cooperative for population estimates, FSEPE, that's like up at the, Office of Finance, they need that as well. And so it's something that we're really trying to get out and get released. But because we don't have those data yet, the modified race data, we don't yet have a blended base that includes the PL94 data. So we don't have anything, we don't have in the blended base any race information coming from the 2020 census. But we will next vintage, not vintage 24, but vintage 25, we will. That's our plan.
There's a follow-up question. You answered, does it mean that Census Bureau still use the blended base 2020 for the July 2024 vintage?
Yes, for the July 2024, July 1, 2024 vintage, we'll still use the blended base, very similar to what was done for the July 1, 2023 vintage. And so it won't include any 2020 census data on race. Yeah.
Can you talk about the incarcerated persons population allocated, how they're counted federally, like in a federal institution? And then if it's a county or like a city owned, and I know that they can adjust those numbers or, move people back to reallocate them differently. Can you talk about?
So for the 2020
how it works.
census, the decision was made that incarcerated individuals would count where they were incarcerated. I don't know, is that what you're talking about?
Federally, we understood they were
Can you use the microphone?
for federally, we understood that they're there, so we can take them out. It's clear and we can take them out if we need to. But then county, if it's a county-owned prison, are they in the population there?
They would be. And the way
Okay.
our population estimates work is we start with the most recent census and, group quarters were enumerated. We got data from the census on group quarters. And then throughout the decade, we make updates to our group quarters population by working closely with our state partners. So each year, our state partners, and these are members of what's called the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, they submit data to us on group quarters that have changed. And so, for instance, if a county has a prison and that prison shuts down, or if that prison expands, then, or if that prison is a male prison, then next year it's a female prison, they let us know that information so that we can incorporate that into our population estimates. And so that's how that works as far as group quarters. I mentioned earlier, group quarters are a relatively small part of the population, but they are a difficult part of making population estimates for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Mary, can you use the microphone for virtual participants?
Users, do you make a point of reporting on MOEs when you produce your reports for stakeholders? So, because I'm always emphasizing, we've got to put in the MOEs here when we report to the board or when we report to superintendent. But, in the old days, we didn't because the census was like, oh, this is exact numbers. But I find that I don't see that in reporting very much, reporting on the MOEs using the ACS data. So I just didn't know if people thought that was important to do when they're reporting to their stakeholders.
Yeah, so again, for the population estimates, we don't have a margin of error. It's probably a good thing if you think about it, because there's a lot of federal funding that's allocated based on those estimates. So if you're just under a threshold or just over it, but it is like, good statistical practice if you're using a survey to report the margin of error. Right, right. If you get down to tract level data and things like that, like come from the PUMs or to come from the the published data tables, they can be really big. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, again, I do really appreciate Dal and Kevin and John inviting me here. Thanks to everyone for their questions and comments. This was helpful for me. Learned some things that we need to, anyway, it's just helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen, for a great presentation and discussion. And thank you all for coming to the workshop. I hope to see you all next year. And don't forget to participate in the survey as well in the when you have a time. Thank you.